Good evening, my friends, and welcome back to Horror Whispers. Tonight we share 6 true trucker horror stories from the Idaho backroads. If you are new here, please subscribe to my channel and hit the bell so you never miss a chilling story. Now let's begin. Robert Hayes had been driving long-haul trucks for 19 years, and in all that time he'd never once felt genuine fear behind the wheel. Sure, there'd been close calls. Black ice near Twin Falls, a blown tire on I-84 that nearly sent him into the median, but fear? Real, bone-deep terror? Never. That changed in March of 2023 on a delivery run that should have been routine. He was hauling refrigerated produce from Boise to a distribution center just outside of Chalice, a small town tucked into the mountains of central Idaho. The route took him north on Highway 55 through McCall, then east on Highway 21, the Ponderosa Pines Scenic Byway. During daylight hours, it was one of the most beautiful drives in the state, winding through dense forests of towering pines and following the curves of the Payette River. But at 2 in the morning in late winter, with patches of black ice still lingering on the pavement, it was a different story entirely. Robert left Boise just after midnight, his 18-wheeler loaded with 26 pallets of fresh lettuce, tomatoes, and bell peppers. The temperature gauge on his dash read 23 degrees. His breath fogged in the cab despite the heater running full blast. He'd made this run a dozen times before, always preferring the night shift when traffic was light and he could make good time. The first hour was uneventful. He cruised through Eagle and Horseshoe Bend without incident, the highway mostly empty except for the occasional sedan heading in the opposite direction. His CB radio crackled with the usual late-night chatter. A couple of truckers discussing weather conditions near Sun Valley, another complaining about construction delays on I-84. Robert half listened, more focused on the road ahead as it began its steady climb into the mountains. By the time he reached Banks, a tiny community where Highway 55 crossed the Payette River, the radio chatter had died down completely. The silence was welcome at first. Robert turned on his truck's stereo, letting classic rock fill the cab. Tom Petty's voice accompanied him as he navigated the increasingly winding road. Snowbanks lined both sides of the highway now, remnants of a storm that had passed through 3 days earlier. Around 1:30 in the morning, just past Smith's Ferry, his CB radio suddenly erupted with static. It was loud, harsh, like someone had cranked the volume to maximum. Robert winced and reached for the dial, turning it down. The static faded but didn't disappear entirely. Instead, it settled into a low, constant hiss that made him frown. Probably interference from the mountains, he muttered to himself. It happened sometimes in areas with steep terrain, radio signals bouncing off rock faces and creating weird feedback loops. He continued driving, the road now climbing more steeply as it approached Round Valley. His headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating snow-dusted pine trees that pressed close to the highway. There were no other vehicles in sight, no houses, no lights except for the dim glow of his instrument panel and the occasional reflective road sign. That's when he heard the voice. It came through the CB radio, barely audible beneath the static. At first, Robert thought he'd imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time. "Help!" Robert's hand froze on the steering wheel. He glanced at the CB unit mounted on his dash. The channel indicator showed he was still on channel 19, the standard frequency for truckers. But that voice, it didn't sound like any trucker he'd ever heard. It was thin, desperate, and wrong somehow. Too high-pitched, almost childlike. "Please help me." "This is northbound 55, Robert said into his handset, keeping his eyes on the road. "Who's calling? What's your 20? Static answered him. Then, after a long pause, "Can't. So cold, please." A chill ran down Robert's spine that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. He'd heard truckers in distress before, flat tires, mechanical failures, even one guy who'd jackknifed his rig on an icy overpass. This was different. The voice sounded genuinely terrified. "What's your location?" Robert tried again. "Are you broken down? Do you need me to call for help?" 55-mile marker, can't see. It's here. Robert's eyes darted to the side of the road, searching for a mile marker. He'd just passed marker 89. The terrain here was treacherous. Steep drop-offs on one side, sheer rock walls on the other. If someone had gone off the road, they could be in serious trouble. "I'm at mile marker 89, Robert said into the handset. "I'll keep an eye out. Stay calm. Help is coming." But the voice didn't respond. Instead, the static grew louder, more aggressive. It filled the cab with a sound like grinding metal, like fingernails on a chalkboard amplified 1,000 times. Robert grimaced and turned the volume down again, but it made no difference. The sound seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. The speakers, the vents, even the walls of the cab itself. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Even his stereo had gone quiet. Robert realized with a start that his engine sounded different too. Rougher, laboring more than it should on this grade. He checked. His gauges. Everything looked normal. Oil pressure good. Temperature fine. RPM steady. He was approaching mile marker 90 when he saw it. A figure stood on the shoulder of the road just at the edge of his headlight beam. It was humanoid but wrong. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at angles that didn't make anatomical sense. Robert's first thought was that it was a tree or maybe a trick of the shadows. But as his truck drew closer, the figure moved. It turned toward him. Robert's blood ran cold. He couldn't make out any features. The figure was just a dark silhouette against the darker forest. But he could feel it watching him, studying him. His instincts screamed at him to accelerate, to get as far from that thing as possible. But his professional training kicked in. If that was a person who needed help, he couldn't just drive past. He began to slow down, his hand hovering over the air brake. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, impossibly still, as if waiting. Robert was 50 feet away when his headlights finally illuminated it fully. It wasn't human. The thing was at least 8 feet tall, with skin that looked gray and leathery in the harsh light. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in hands with too many fingers. But it was the face, if you could call it that made Robert's stomach clench. It had no eyes, just smooth skin where eyes should be. No nose, just a mouth that split its head nearly in half, filled with teeth that were too white, too perfect. And it was smiling. Robert's foot slammed down on the accelerator. His rig lurched forward, the trailer swaying slightly as the wheels struggled for traction on the cold pavement. In his side mirror, he watched the figure grow smaller, still standing motionless on the shoulder. Then, in the space of a single blink, it was gone. His CB radio crackled back to life. "See ya, thank you, see ya, thank you." The voice was different now, deeper. Multiple voices speaking in unison, overlapping each other in a hideous chorus. Robert grabbed the CB unit and ripped it free from its mounting, letting it dangle by its power cord. But the voices didn't stop. They continued, growing louder, more insistent. "See you. Thank you. See you. Thank you." Robert's hands were shaking so badly he could barely keep the wheel straight. The road ahead blurred as tears of pure terror streamed down his face. He pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing his truck past safe speeds for this stretch of highway. The engine roared in protest, but he didn't care. He needed to get out of here, away from whatever that thing was, away from those voices that wouldn't stop. Mile marker 95. 96, 97. The voices were reaching a crescendo now, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all speaking the same words over and over. See you, thank you, see you, thank you. Then at mile marker 98 they stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. Robert realized he was hyperventilating, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He eased off the accelerator, letting his speed drop back to something reasonable. His entire body was drenched in sweat despite the cold. He drove the rest of the way to Cascade in a daze, barely registering the turns and curves of the highway. When he finally pulled into a truck stop just off Highway 55, he sat in his cab for 20 minutes. Unable to move, unable to process what he'd just experienced. Eventually, he forced himself to get out and inspect his truck. Everything looked normal. The refrigeration unit was running smoothly, the tires were fine. The CB radio, still dangling from its power cord, showed no sign of damage. Robert never took Highway 55 at night again. He rerouted all his deliveries to avoid that stretch of road after dark, even if it added hours to his drive time. When other truckers asked him why, he never gave them a straight answer. How could he explain what he'd seen? What he'd heard? But sometimes, late at night, when he was alone in his cab on some other dark highway, he'd think about that figure on the side of the road, about those voices on the CB radio, and he'd wonder, had it been real? Or had something in those Idaho mountains reached into his mind and shown him a glimpse of something that existed just outside normal reality? He never found out, and a part of him was grateful for that. Patricia Sullivan considered herself a rational woman. She'd driven trucks for 12 years, mostly long-haul routes through the western United States, and she prided herself on her no-nonsense approach to the job. While other drivers traded ghost stories at rest stops or talked about strange lights in the sky, Patricia focused on her logbook, her fuel efficiency, and her delivery schedule. Superstition had no place in the cab of her Kenworth T680. That all changed on a September night in 2024, somewhere on Idaho's Highway 21. Patricia was hauling construction equipment, a flatbed load of steel beams and concrete forms, from Boise to Stanley, a small resort town nestled at the base of the Sawtooth Mountains. The load was perfectly secured, well within weight limits, and her truck was running beautifully. Everything about the run was textbook perfect. She'd left Boise around 6 in the evening, planning to arrive in Stanley by midnight. The route took her northeast on Highway 21, following the Ponderosa Pine Scenic Byway through the Boise National Forest. She'd driven this road countless times, in every season and every kind of weather. She knew every curve, every steep grade, every turnout where you could pull over and let faster traffic pass. The sun set as she climbed out of the foothills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that gradually faded to deep blue and then black. Patricia switched on her running lights and settled into the rhythm of the drive. The road here was relatively straight, following the Mores Creek Valley up toward Idaho City. She passed through Idaho City around 7:30. The old mining town was quiet, most of its shops and restaurants already closed for the night. Patricia stopped at a gas station on the outskirts to top off her tanks and use the restroom. A young clerk behind the counter barely looked up from his phone as she paid for her fuel. "Heading up to Stanley?" he asked without much interest. "That's right," Patricia replied. "Road's clear all the way. No construction tonight." He went back to scrolling through his phone. Patricia thanked him and returned to her truck. Within minutes, she was back on Highway 21, continuing her climb into the mountains. The forest pressed close on both sides now, dense stands of Ponderosa pine and Douglas fir that blocked out what little moonlight there was. Her headlights seemed almost feeble against the overwhelming darkness. Around 8:45, she reached Moores Creek summit, the high point of this section of highway at just over 6,000 feet elevation. From here, the road descended slightly before climbing again toward Banner Creek Summit, the highest point on the entire route at just over 7,000 feet. Patricia checked her mirrors out of habit. No one behind her, no one ahead. She was completely alone on this stretch of mountain highway. The solitude didn't bother her. She'd always preferred driving at night when traffic was light and she could make good time without constantly worrying about tourist RVs or distracted drivers. Mile marker 65 slid past on her right, then 66, 67. The road here followed a series of gentle S-curves as it traced the contours of the mountainside. Patricia downshifted slightly, letting the engine help control her speed on the descent. Her GPS showed she was making excellent time. At this rate, she'd be in Stanley well before midnight, maybe even by 11:30. That's when she noticed the mile marker. 67. She'd just passed it a minute ago, hadn't she? Patricia frowned, glancing in her mirrors. But of course, she couldn't see anything behind her now, just darkness and the faint red glow of her taillights. Maybe she'd misread the first marker. Easy to do when you were tired and the numbers were small and reflective. She continued driving, pushing the odd moment out of her mind. The road curved left, then right, following the same gentle S pattern it had before. The same dense forest pressed close on both sides. The same. Mile marker 67. Patricia's hands tightened on the steering wheel. That couldn't be right. She'd been driving for at least 3 or 4 minutes since seeing the last marker. She should be at 70 or 71 by now, not back at 67. She checked her odometer. It showed she'd traveled 2.3 miles since leaving Idaho City, which was clearly wrong because Idaho City was at least 20 miles behind her now. "What the hell?" she muttered. Her GPS still showed her on Highway 21, a blue line indicating her position on the digital map. But as she watched, the blue dot representing her truck seemed to stutter, jumping back a short distance before continuing forward again. Then it jumped back again, and again. Patricia felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. She was a rational woman, yes, but she was also a professional driver with years of experience, and that experience was telling her that something was very, very wrong. The road curved left, then right. The same S pattern, the same dense forest. Mile marker 67. "No," Patricia said aloud. "No, no, no." She accelerated slightly, pushing her truck to 50 miles per hour. Faster than was strictly safe on this winding road, but she needed to brake whatever was happening. The engine rumbled in response, pulling the heavy load with steady power. The center line of the highway blurred past beneath her wheels. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3. Mile marker 67. Patricia slammed on her brakes. The truck shuddered to a stop, the trailer swaying slightly before settling. She sat there in the middle of the highway, engine idling, hands trembling on the wheel. Her GPS showed her still moving forward, but she was parked. The blue dot continued its stuttering progress along Highway 21, jumping back, moving forward, jumping back. She grabbed her cell phone from the cup holder. No signal, not even a single bar. That wasn't unusual this deep in the mountains, but it still made her feel more isolated, more vulnerable. "Think," she told herself. "Think rationally, there has to be an explanation." Maybe she was tired. Maybe she'd been driving on autopilot and hadn't realized she'd somehow turned around or taken a wrong turn. But that didn't make sense. Highway 21 didn't have any turnoffs along this stretch. Just the main road winding through the forest. Maybe her odometer was broken, but that wouldn't explain the mile markers, which she'd seen with her own eyes. 3 times now. The same marker. Mile 67. Patricia put the truck back in gear and started driving again, more slowly this time. She kept her eyes fixed on the side of the road, watching for the next marker. It should appear within a mile. They were regularly spaced along all Idaho highways. The road curved left, then right. The same pattern, the same trees, the same... She saw it up ahead, reflecting in her headlights. The green rectangle with white numbers. 67. "Please," Patricia whispered. "Please, not again." But as her truck drew closer, the numbers seemed to shift and shimmer in the light. For just a moment, less than a second, really, it looked like something else. Not a number at all, but a symbol. A shape that hurt to look at, that made her eyes water and her head pound. Then it was just a mile marker again. 67. Patricia's rational mind was screaming at her that this couldn't be happening. Mile markers didn't repeat. Roads didn't loop back on themselves without intersections or turnoffs. Physics didn't work this way. Reality didn't work this way. But here she was, passing the same marker for the fourth time. She tried a different approach. Instead of continuing forward, she brought her truck to a complete stop right next to mile marker 67. She put on her hazard lights and grabbed a flashlight from behind her seat. Then, steeling herself, she climbed out of the cab. The cold hit her immediately. It had to be in the low 40s, maybe upper 30s, and she'd only been wearing a light jacket. Her breath plumed white in the beam of her flashlight. The forest around her was absolutely silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. Just an oppressive, waiting silence. Patricia walked up to the mile marker and examined it closely. It looked completely normal. Standard Idaho Department of Transportation design, a green rectangle with reflective white numbers. 67. She reached out and touched it. The metal was cold and solid and real. Behind her, her truck's diesel engine continued its steady idle. The hazard lights flashed orange, reflecting off the trees. Everything seemed normal, but it wasn't. She could feel it in her bones. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with this place. She walked back to her truck, climbed into the cab, and sat there thinking. What were her options? She could keep driving forward and see if she eventually broke free of whatever this loop was. She could turn around and head back toward Idaho City, or she could stay put and wait for another vehicle to come along. Though given how empty this road had been, that might not happen until morning. Patricia decided to try turning around. If she was somehow caught in a spatial anomaly, and yes, the rational part of her mind was having a very hard time with that concept, then maybe traveling in the opposite direction would break her free. She pulled a 3-point turn, carefully maneuvering her flatbed load on the narrow highway, and started driving back the way she'd come. The road curved right, then left. The S pattern reversed now that she was heading southwest instead of northeast. Mile marker 67 appeared in her headlights. Patricia actually laughed. It was a short, slightly hysterical sound, but it helped release some of the tension that had been building in her chest. Of course that's what would happen. She stopped laughing when she realized something else. She was going to run out of fuel eventually. Her tanks were 3/4 full when she'd left Idaho City, which gave her maybe 4 or 5 more hours of driving. And if she couldn't escape this loop, this repeating stretch of highway that shouldn't exist, what would happen when her engine died? The thought of being stranded here in this impossible place with no cell signal and no way to call for help made her stomach clench with fear. She kept driving. Forward and backward, past mile marker 67 over and over and over 10 times. 20. 50. She lost count. Time seemed to lose meaning. Was it 9 o'clock? 10? Midnight? Her phone's clock kept resetting itself, the digital numbers flickering and changing randomly. At some point, she couldn't say when, Patricia noticed something new. The trees on either side of the road were different. Not different species, but different arrangement. as if the forest itself was being rearranged each time she passed through this section of highway. A gap in the trees where there had been solid forest before, a fallen log that hadn't been there on the previous loop. The changes were subtle at first, but they grew more pronounced. The road surface itself seemed to shift, cracks appearing and disappearing in the pavement. The mile marker, always the same number, always 67, began to look weathered and worn, as if years were passing in the space between one loop and the next. Patricia's fuel gauge was approaching the quarter tank mark when she finally saw salvation. Headlights. Coming toward her from the northeast, she almost cried with relief. Another vehicle, another person, proof that she wasn't completely cut off from the rest of reality. She flashed her high beams and began to slow down, preparing to flag down whoever was approaching. The vehicle drew closer. It was a pickup truck, dark-colored, traveling at a steady speed. Patricia positioned her rig partially across the highway to make sure the truck would have to stop. The pickup's headlights grew brighter, closer, and then it passed through her, not around her, not beside her, through her truck, through her trailer, through her as if none of them existed. Patricia sat frozen in shock. In her mirrors, she watched the pickup's taillights continue down the highway behind her, unaffected, unaltered, completely unaware that it had just driven through 18 tons of truck and cargo as if they were made of mist. That's when the fear truly set in. Not the nervous apprehension she'd been feeling, but real, primal terror. Because if that truck had passed through her, then maybe she wasn't really here at all. Maybe she'd somehow slipped out of normal reality and into some shadow version of Highway 21 that existed parallel to the real world but forever separate from it. The mile marker appeared again in her headlights. 67. But this time, the numbers were wrong. They shifted and changed as she watched, cycling through different digits, 67, 76, 16, 91, and others that weren't numbers at all, but symbols that made her head hurt to look at. Patricia closed her eyes. "Please," she said aloud. "Please, let me out. I don't understand what's happening. I don't understand the rules. I just want to go home." The silence that answered her was complete and absolute. She opened her eyes. The road ahead looked the same as it had a moment ago. The same forest, the same darkness. But something felt different, lighter somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted from the air around her. Patricia put her truck in gear and started driving. Slowly at first, then faster as her confidence grew. The road curved left, then right. The familiar S pattern, mile marker 68, appeared in her headlights. Patricia actually sobbed with relief. 68. Not 67. 68. The next marker in sequence. She'd broken free. Whatever had caught her in that loop had finally released her. She drove the rest of the way to Stanley in a daze, barely registering the passage of time or distance. When she finally pulled into the construction site where she was scheduled to deliver her load, the sun was just beginning to rise over the Sawtooth Mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The site foreman looked surprised to see her. "You're early," he said. "Wasn't expecting you until tomorrow." Patricia checked her phone. The date was wrong. According to her phone, it was still the previous night. She'd lost almost 12 hours somehow, but she was too exhausted, too emotionally drained to argue or try to explain. She helped with the unloading in silence, then climbed back into her truck and drove straight to Boise without stopping. She parked at a truck stop, went inside to the showers, and stood under hot water for 45 minutes, trying to wash away the memory of those endless loops on Highway 21. She never drove that route at night again. In fact, she stopped taking loads to Stanley altogether, finding excuses to decline whenever her dispatcher tried to assign her that run. Other drivers took those jobs instead, and none of them ever reported anything unusual. But Patricia knew the truth. Somewhere on Highway 21 between mile markers 67 and 68, there was a place where reality bent in on itself. A trap for the unwary, and she'd been lucky enough, or perhaps smart enough, to find her way out. She wondered sometimes if anyone else had ever gotten caught in that loop, and more disturbingly, if they'd ever escaped. Marcus Chen had seen a lot of strange things in his 23 years of driving trucks across America. He'd seen ball lightning hover over I-40 in New Mexico, watched a tornado form in real time on a Kansas highway, and once passed a convoy of military vehicles hauling something covered in tarps that made his Geiger counter, which he kept in his cab after an incident near a nuclear plant, click erratically for 10 miles afterward. But nothing had prepared him for what he found on Idaho's Highway 20 on a cold November night in 2024. Marcus was hauling electronics, computer components mostly, from Portland to Pocatello. The load was valuable but not particularly heavy, which meant he could make good time on the long straight stretches of Idaho Highway. His route took him east on Interstate 84 to Mountain Home, then north on Highway 20 through some of the most remote country in southern Idaho. He'd made this run dozens of times before. Highway 20 cut through high desert terrain, sagebrush and lava rock stretching to the horizon in every direction. During the day, you could see for miles nothing but empty land under an enormous sky. At night, the darkness was absolute, broken only by the occasional ranch light or the distant glow of a small town. Marcus left Mountain Home around 9 in the evening. The highway was nearly empty. He'd maybe passed 3 other vehicles in the first hour of driving. The radio played classic country and he sang along absently, his mind half on the road and half on the next book he wanted to read. Marcus was an avid reader, usually keeping a paperback tucked in his door pocket for breaks at rest stops. Around 10:30 he passed through Arco, a tiny town that claimed to be the first community in the world powered by nuclear energy. There was a truth to that claim. The experimental breeder reactor I was located nearby, a relic of the Cold War era. Marcus had stopped to visit the facility once during daylight, taking the tour with a handful of other curious tourists. It was fascinating in a geeky sort of way, seeing the old technology and learning about the early days of nuclear power. The road beyond Arco climbed gradually, heading northeast toward the pass that would take him into the Lost River Valley. The landscape here was otherworldly, ancient lava flows that looked black and cracked in his headlights, mountains rising like dark silhouettes against a sky full of stars. There was no moon tonight, which made the darkness feel even more profound. Mile marker 240 appeared in his headlights, then 241, 242. That's when Marcus noticed the lights. Off to his right, maybe a mile or 2 into the desert, a cluster of bright white lights blazed against the darkness. They looked like industrial lighting, the kind of high-intensity floods you'd see at a construction site or warehouse facility. But there was nothing out here. No towns, no ranches, nothing but empty desert and lava rock. Marcus frowned, slowing down slightly. The lights were stationary, not moving like vehicle headlights would be. And they were too bright, too numerous to be explained as someone camping or even a ranch having electrical problems. It looked like a small city had been dropped into the middle of nowhere. His curiosity was piqued. Marcus had always been the type to investigate anomalies, to seek out explanations for things that didn't make immediate sense. It was what made him a good driver. Attention to detail, awareness of his surroundings, an instinct for when something was off. He checked his mirrors. No other vehicles in sight. He wasn't on a tight schedule. His delivery window in Pocatello didn't start until 8 in the morning, which gave him plenty of time. Why not take a quick detour and see what those lights were? A dirt road appeared on his right, unmarked and unpaved but wide enough for his truck. Marcus slowed to a crawl and carefully turned off the highway. The truck bounced over the rough surface, his headlights illuminating a narrow track that led straight toward those mysterious lights. The road, if you could call it that, was in surprisingly good condition for something so remote. The surface was packed hard, and someone had clearly graded it recently. Marcus could see fresh tire tracks in the dust, not just passenger vehicles, but large trucks. Semi-trucks, judging by the width and depth of the treads. That made sense, he supposed. If there was some kind of facility out here, it would need supply trucks for deliveries. But why would anyone build anything in such a remote location? And why weren't there any signs on the highway indicating its presence? Marcus drove for about 10 minutes, covering roughly 2 miles. The lights grew steadily brighter as he approached, resolving into individual fixtures mounted on tall poles. He could make out structures now, buildings, warehouses, maybe even a guard shack at what looked like a gate. As he drew closer, Marcus felt a growing unease. The facility was enormous, easily the size of a small airport. Multiple buildings arranged in a grid pattern, all of them windowless with smooth concrete walls. The lighting was so bright that it created a sphere of daylight in the middle of the desert night, making it hard to look directly at the compound. But what really bothered Marcus was the complete absence of people. No vehicles moving, no workers visible, no guards at the gate, which stood wide open as if inviting him in. Just those buildings and those impossibly bright lights and an oppressive silence that even through his closed windows felt wrong. Marcus brought his truck to a stop about 300 yards from the main gate. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to turn around, to get back on Highway 20 and forget he'd ever seen this place. But his curiosity was still stronger than his fear. What was this facility? Some kind of government installation? A corporate warehouse? A secret research station? He grabbed his flashlight and his phone, checking the screen. No signal, which wasn't surprising given how remote this area was. He took a quick photo of the facility, the image bright and clear on his phone's display. Then he climbed down from his cab. The cold hit him immediately. It had to be in the 20s, with a wind that cut through his jacket and made his eyes water. Marcus pulled his collar up and started walking toward the gate, flashlight in hand, though he barely needed it. The facility's lighting was more than adequate. As he got closer, he could hear a sound, a low, constant hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was the kind of deep vibration you felt in your chest more than heard with your ears, like standing next to massive generators or transformers. The gate was indeed open, swinging slightly in the wind. Marcus paused at the threshold, looking around for any sign of security cameras or motion sensors. He couldn't see any, but that didn't mean they weren't there. For all he knew, he'd already been spotted, and someone was on their way to escort him off the property. He stepped through the gate. The interior of the compound was just as well lit as it had appeared from a distance. The buildings were arranged in neat rows with wide streets between them, all paved with smooth asphalt. Marcus walked down the main thoroughfare, his footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. Every building he passed was identical, windowless, featureless except for a single metal door and a numeric designation painted in white. Building 7, Building 12, Building 23. He tried one of the doors, locked. He tried another, also locked. In fact, every door he tested was secured with no obvious means of entry like a keypad or card reader. They were just smooth metal surfaces with recessed handles that wouldn't budge. The humming sound was getting louder the deeper into the compound he went. Marcus could feel it vibrating in his bones now, making his teeth ache. Whatever was generating that sound was powerful, and it was close. He rounded a corner and stopped dead. In the center of the compound was a structure unlike any of the others. While the surrounding buildings were rectangular and plain, this one was cylindrical and massive, easily 100 feet in diameter and reaching at least 50 feet into the air. The surface appeared to be polished metal, steel, or aluminum that reflected the surrounding lights in dizzying patterns. And it was rotating. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the entire structure was turning on some kind of axis. Marcus could see now that the humming sound was coming from this building, or more accurately, from whatever machinery was inside it. The vibration was so intense this close that he could see ripples in the puddles of water that had collected in low spots on the asphalt. Marcus approached carefully, circling the structure at a distance. There were no markings on it, no signs or warnings. Just smooth metal rotating endlessly in the desert night. As he completed his circuit, he found what looked like an entrance, a rectangular section of wall that stood slightly recessed from the rest of the cylinder. He reached out to touch it, and the metal was warm. Not hot enough to burn, but distinctly warmer than the ambient air temperature. Heat was radiating from whatever was inside, along with that relentless humming that was now making him feel nauseated. Marcus pulled out his phone to take another photo. He raised it, framed the shot, and pressed the button. The camera app crashed, not just closed, crashed with an error message he'd never seen before. Imaging prohibited in restricted airspace. Marcus stared at his phone. Restricted airspace. He was on the ground. How could... He didn't finish the thought because at that moment all the lights went out. The transition from daylight bright to absolute darkness was instantaneous and total. Marcus stood frozen, his eyes struggling to adjust. He could still hear the humming, still feel the vibration, but he couldn't see anything. Not the buildings, not the rotating cylinder, not even his own hand when he held it in front of his face. He fumbled for his flashlight, nearly dropping it in his panic. When he finally got it on, the beam seemed pathetically weak compared to the lights that had been flooding the compound moments before. But it was enough to see by, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The buildings were gone. Not destroyed or collapsed, just gone. Where there had been neat rows of warehouses and structures, there was now only empty desert. Sagebrush and rocks and dusty ground. The asphalt streets had vanished too, leaving only the packed dirt of the ancient lava plain. Marcus spun in a circle, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The compound that had been here seconds ago had simply ceased to exist. The only thing that remained was the cylindrical structure behind him, still humming, still rotating in the darkness. He ran. Marcus didn't think about it, didn't try to rationalize what he'd just witnessed. He simply turned and ran as fast as his legs could carry him, back the way he'd come, or at least where he thought he'd come from. Without the streets and buildings as landmarks, he had no reference points in the darkness. He ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, his breath burning in his lungs, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly ahead of him. Behind him, that awful humming sound was growing louder instead of fainter, as if the thing was following him or expanding or... His foot caught on something and he went down hard, landing face first in the dirt. His flashlight flew from his hand and went out, plunging him into total darkness. Marcus lay there gasping, tasting blood where he'd bitten his tongue, his hands scraped and bleeding from breaking his fall. And in the darkness, the humming stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. Marcus lay perfectly still, not daring to move or even breathe. He could feel something massive nearby, could sense its presence like you might sense someone standing behind you in a dark room. It was aware of him, studying him. Time passed. Seconds or minutes or hours. Marcus couldn't tell. He existed in a state of pure terror, his mind unable to process what was happening, his body locked in place by fear. And then, gradually, light began to seep back into the world. Not the harsh white floods of the facility, but the natural pre-dawn glow of approaching sunrise. Marcus lifted his head and saw that he was lying in open desert about 50 yards from Highway 20. His truck sat on the shoulder where he'd pulled off, exactly where he'd left it. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the pain in his hands and knees. The desert around him looked completely normal. No buildings, no rotating cylinder, no gate or roads or any sign that the facility had ever existed. His flashlight lay a few feet away, its lens cracked but still functional. Marcus stumbled back to his truck, climbed into the cab, and locked all the doors. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. When the engine roared to life, he actually cried with relief at the familiar sound. He pulled back onto Highway 20 and drove straight to Pocatello without stopping, running on pure adrenaline and terror. The sun rose as he drove, painting the desert in shades of gold and red that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. When he arrived at his delivery location in Pocatello, the receiving dock manager commented that he looked terrible. Marcus mumbled something about not sleeping well and helped with the unloading in a daze. It was only later, when he was checking into a motel for a day of rest before his return trip, that he remembered the photos he'd taken. He pulled out his phone and opened his photo app. The image he'd taken of the facility from a distance was gone, not just deleted, but erased in a way that left a gap in his photo timeline, as if the app had detected corrupted data and purged it. The second photo he'd tried to take, of the rotating cylinder, had never been saved at all. But something else was in his photo library. A picture he didn't remember taking, dated from that morning, time-stamped at 4:17 a.m., right around when the lights had gone out. Marcus opened the image. It showed the interior of the cylindrical structure. Somehow his phone had captured what was inside, and what he saw there made him immediately wish he hadn't looked. The image showed a vast chamber filled with machinery that looked both ancient and impossibly advanced. Gears and pistons that moved in ways that violated geometry, metal surfaces inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at, and at the center, a doorway, or a hole, or something that existed in the space between those concepts. A perfect circle of absolute blackness that looked less like an absence of light and more like a presence of something else entirely. And around the edges of that darkness, Marcus could see things, shapes, entities, pressing against the boundary between wherever they were and where we are, testing its strength, looking for weaknesses. Marcus deleted the photo, then he deleted it from his trash folder. Then he factory reset his entire phone just to be sure. He never drove Highway 20 past Arco at night again. In fact, he started avoiding Idaho altogether when possible, finding routes that took him through other states even if they added days to his travel time. His dispatcher thought he was losing his edge, getting old and timid, but Marcus didn't care. Because he knew something that most people didn't. Somewhere in the desert north of Arco, there was a facility that existed in multiple states of reality simultaneously. Sometimes it was there, fully manifested and visible. Sometimes it existed just outside perception, a shadow of itself. And at its center was something that should never have been built, that was keeping something terrible from entering our world. Or maybe, and this was the thought that woke Marcus up in cold sweats some nights, maybe that facility wasn't keeping something out. Maybe it was letting something in. Slowly, carefully, a little bit at a time. He hoped he'd never find out which. Dennis Kowalski had been a trucker for 36 years, and he'd learned to trust his instincts. That little voice in the back of your head that said slow down before you came around a blind curve to find a deer in the road. The feeling in your gut that told you to skip a particular rest stop even though you needed to use the facilities. The inexplicable urge to check your trailer one more time even though you'd already inspected it thoroughly. In December of 2023, on a run through northern Idaho, Dennis's instincts were screaming at him. But this time, he couldn't figure out why. He was hauling a load of timber, Douglas fir logs bound for a mill in Spokane, Washington, from a logging operation near Pierce, Idaho. The route took him north on Highway 11, a narrow two-lane road that wound through the Clearwater National Forest. It was beautiful country when you could see it, all mountains and rivers and endless trees. But on this particular night, in the middle of a snowstorm, visibility was down to maybe 50 feet. Dennis kept his speed low, maybe 35 miles per hour, his wipers working overtime to clear the heavy, wet snow from his windshield. The highway followed the North Fork of the Clearwater River, though he couldn't see the water through the curtain of white. His headlights reflected off a million snowflakes, creating an almost hypnotic effect that made it hard to judge distance or depth. He'd been driving for about 2 hours when he first noticed the other truck. It appeared in his mirrors, another semi, hauling what looked like a flatbed load of logs similar to his own. The truck was maybe a quarter-mile back, its headlights visible as two dim orbs in the swirling snow. Dennis felt a small measure of relief at the sight. Having another trucker nearby on a night like this was reassuring. If one of them ran into trouble, a breakdown, an accident, anything, at least they wouldn't be completely alone. Dennis continued driving, his focus on the road ahead. The other truck maintained its distance behind him, neither gaining nor falling back. Professional driving, keeping a safe following distance in hazardous conditions. Dennis approved. After about 15 minutes, Dennis's CB radio crackled to life. "Northbound 11, you got your ears on." It was the trucker behind him checking in, standard road courtesy. Dennis picked up his handset. "I'm here. Conditions are pretty rough, huh?" "That's a 10-4. Name's Marcus, just making sure I wasn't the only idiot out here tonight." Dennis smiled. "Dennis, yeah, this storm came in faster than the weather service predicted. You heading to Spokane?" "Lewiston, got a load of lumber for the mill down there." "You?" "Spokane, similar cargo." They chatted for a few more minutes, the way truckers do, comparing notes on road conditions, discussing the best places to stop for coffee, sharing stories about close calls and memorable runs. It helped pass the time and kept Dennis alert, which was important on a night like this when the repetitive motion of windshield wipers and the endless white snow could lull you into a dangerous trance. Around mile marker 42, the road began a long, gradual descent. Dennis downshifted, letting his engine help control his speed on the slick pavement. In his mirrors, he could see the other truck's headlights growing slightly brighter as it followed him down the grade. "Watch yourself on this descent," Dennis said into his CB. "Road gets slippery through here." "Appreciate it," Marcus responded. "I'll keep it slow." They continued in comfortable silence for a while. The snow was beginning to let up slightly, visibility improving to maybe 75 feet. Dennis could make out the dark shapes of trees on either side of the highway now, and occasionally a road sign would loom out of the darkness. That's when he noticed something odd. The truck behind him was closer now. Not dangerously close, but definitely nearer than it had been before. And its headlights looked different, slightly bluer or maybe whiter than they'd appeared earlier. Dennis frowned but didn't think too much of it. Headlights could look different depending on weather conditions and how the light refracted through snow and moisture. Another few miles passed. The descent leveled out into a flat stretch that ran parallel to the river. Dennis could hear the rush of water through his closed windows, high and fast from snowmelt and rain. He glanced in his mirrors again. The truck was even closer now, maybe 50 yards back. And something about it looked wrong. The headlights were definitely brighter, whiter, and the shape of the cab seemed different. Squarer, somehow, less modern. Dennis picked up his CB handset. "Marcus, you're getting pretty close back there." Might want to open up the gap a bit in case I have to brake suddenly. Static answered him. Then, after a long pause, 10-4, will do. But the voice didn't sound quite right. It was deeper than before, with an odd echo quality that made it sound like Marcus was speaking from inside a large, empty room. Dennis's instincts began to tingle. Something was off. He couldn't put his finger on exactly what, but his gut was telling him that the truck behind him wasn't quite the same truck that had been there before. He accelerated slightly, pushing his speed up to 40. The truck behind him matched his speed, maintaining that same 50-yard distance. Dennis accelerated more, 45 miles per hour now, faster than was really safe on this snow-covered highway, but his unease was growing by the second. The truck behind him accelerated too. "Marcus," Dennis said into his CB. "That you back there?" Static, then, 10-4, it's me. But it wasn't. Dennis knew it with sudden, absolute certainty. Whatever was driving that truck behind him, whatever was speaking on his CB radio with a voice that was almost but not quite human, it wasn't the friendly driver he'd been chatting with earlier. He pressed harder on the accelerator. 50 miles per hour. The highway blurred past beneath his wheels, the center line barely visible through the snow. His trailer swayed slightly, the heavy logs shifting in their chains. Too fast. He was going way too fast for these conditions. The truck behind him kept pace effortlessly. Dennis's mind raced. What should he do? He couldn't outrun whatever was following him, not in these conditions, not with a full load. He could try to pull over, but that would just make him a sitting duck. He needed a rest area. He remembered there was a rest area coming up, maybe 5 miles ahead. A place with bathrooms and picnic tables and, most importantly, lights. Maybe if he could get there, into a lit area where he could see what was following him. Mile marker 48 appeared in his headlights. 7 miles to the rest area, not 5. But he could make it. He had to. "Who are you?" Dennis asked into his CB, his voice tight with fear. "What do you want?" The response came immediately, and it was unmistakably wrong. Multiple voices speaking in unison, overlapping each other. "Dennis? Dennis Kowalski, 36 years. 36 years driving. We know you. We've always known you." How did it know his name? He'd never given his full name, only his first name. And those voices? They sounded like recordings, like someone had cut up his words from earlier and was playing them back at him. Dennis looked in his mirrors and his blood ran cold. The truck behind him wasn't a truck anymore. It still had the rough shape, the cab, the trailer, the headlights. But it was all wrong. The proportions were off, distorted, as if someone had tried to build a truck from memory and got most of the details right but missed some crucial aspect of what made it real. The headlights were too bright, too white, like burning magnesium. And the trailer seemed to extend back farther than it should, fading into the snowy darkness as if it had no end. And it was getting closer. Dennis floored the accelerator. His engine roared in protest, the RPMs climbing into the red zone. He was doing 60 now, 70, way beyond safe on this slick highway. The truck bucked and swayed, the trailer threatening to jackknife with every slight turn. But he didn't care. All that mattered was getting away from that thing behind him. Mile marker 50. 4 more miles to the rest area. The knot truck was right behind him now, its impossibly bright headlights flooding his cab with white light that cast no shadows. Dennis could see every detail of his interior in that light. The worn upholstery, the dust on his dashboard, the photo of his grandkids he kept clipped to his sun visor. Everything was rendered in stark, merciless detail. 3 miles. The voices on his CB had become a constant stream, no longer forming coherent words, but just a babble of sound that was somehow still recognizable as his own voice, cut up and rearranged into patterns that made his head hurt to hear. 2 miles. Dennis could see the knot truck in his side mirror now. The cab was close enough that he should have been able to make out the driver, but there was nothing there. Just an empty windshield reflecting his own face back at him, distorted and wrong. 1 mile. The rest area appeared in his headlights like a miracle. A small parking lot with a few picnic tables, a concrete building housing restrooms, and most importantly, 4 tall lamp posts that cast pools of yellow sodium light. It looked beautiful. It looked like salvation. Dennis yanked his wheel to the right, not bothering to signal or slow down properly. His truck careened into the rest area, tires screaming on the pavement beneath the snow. He slammed on his brakes, sending his trailer into a controlled skid that brought him to a stop diagonal across 3 parking spaces. He sat there, engine running, hands locked on the steering wheel, and watched the highway. The knot truck approached. He could see its lights through the trees that lined the rest area, bright white beacons cutting through the snowfall. It slowed as it neared the rest area entrance. Stopped. The lights sat there for what felt like an eternity, just at the edge of the lamppost glow. Then slowly they began to dim. The bright white faded to blue, then to red, then to something that wasn't quite color at all. And when they finally disappeared completely, Dennis realized he couldn't remember exactly what he'd been so afraid of. There'd been another truck on the highway. That much he knew. A friendly driver named Marcus heading to Lewiston. They'd chatted on the CB for a while, comparing notes on the storm. And then, had Marcus turned off on a side road? Or maybe gotten ahead of him somehow during the descent? Dennis couldn't quite remember. The details felt slippery, like trying to recall a dream after waking. He sat in the rest area for another 20 minutes, finishing the thermos of coffee he'd brought from home. The snow had stopped completely now, the clouds breaking up to reveal stars. When he finally pulled back onto Highway 11, the road was empty in both directions. He reached Spokane without incident 4 hours later. Delivered his load, filed his paperwork. Everything routine and normal. But sometimes, late at night when he was alone on a dark highway, Dennis would glance in his mirrors and feel a chill run down his spine. Because for just a moment, less than a second really, he'd swear he could see headlights behind him that were slightly too bright, slightly too white. And he'd remember something he couldn't quite grasp. Something about Highway 11 and a voice on the CB radio that wasn't quite human. Then he'd blink, and the moment would pass, and he'd convince himself it was just his imagination, just tired eyes playing tricks on him. But deep down, in that part of his mind where instinct lived, Dennis knew the truth. Something had followed him that night, something that wore the shape of a truck the way a person might wear a mask. And it was still out there on some lonely Idaho highway, waiting for the next driver to come along, waiting to follow them home. Linda Martinez had hauled just about everything in her 16 years as an independent long-haul trucker. Furniture, electronics, food products, construction materials, even a shipment of alpacas once that bleated mournfully the entire way from Oregon to Colorado. She prided herself on being professional, reliable, and willing to take jobs that other drivers might turn down. Which is why, when her broker called with an odd request in January of 2024, she said yes without asking too many questions. It's a specialty cargo, the broker explained over the phone. Needs climate control, and this is important, Linda. You cannot under any circumstances open the trailer or inspect the cargo during transit. Linda frowned. That's unusual. What am I hauling? Scientific equipment. Sensitive materials for a research facility. The client is very particular about security protocols. What kind of research facility? There was a pause. Does it matter? The pay is $5,000 for a one-night run from Salmon, Idaho to Idaho Falls. That's 3 times your usual rate, $5,000, for 300 miles. Linda did the mental math. Even accounting for fuel and other expenses, she'd clear close to $4,000 in profit. That was too good to pass up, even if the job had some strange conditions attached. "Fine," she said. "When and where?" The pickup location was a warehouse on the outskirts of Salmon, a small town in central Idaho surrounded by mountains and national forest. Linda arrived just after sunset, backing her refrigerated trailer up to a loading dock that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The building itself was nondescript. Corrugated metal siding, no windows, no signage. Two men were waiting for her. They didn't give their names or engage in small talk. They just handed her a manifest that listed the cargo as research materials, temperature-controlled, with a weight of 4,000 pounds. Then they disappeared into the warehouse, returning 15 minutes later. "All loaded," one of them said. He handed her a padlock. "Secure the trailer. Don't open it. If you have any mechanical issues or if the refrigeration fails, call this number immediately." He gave her a business card with just a phone number, no name or company. "What's the temperature supposed to be?" Linda asked. 38 degrees, not negotiable. Any warmer and you'll damage the cargo." Linda nodded and secured the padlock on her trailer doors. She did her usual pre-trip inspection, lights, tires, brakes, and then climbed into her cab. The route to Idaho Falls was straightforward enough. South on Highway 93 to Highway 20, then east to her destination. She'd be there by 2 or 3 in the morning, well before her delivery window opened at 6 a.m. She pulled out of Salmon as the last light was fading from the sky. Highway 93 cut through the Lemhi Valley, a long corridor between mountain ranges that looked beautiful during the day but felt oppressively isolated at night. Linda turned on her stereo and settled in for what should have been an easy drive. 20 minutes into the trip, she noticed the smell. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the diesel fumes and pine-scented air freshener she kept hanging from her rearview mirror. But it grew steadily stronger as she drove, a sweet, organic smell that reminded her of overripe fruit, or meat starting to turn. Linda checked her refrigeration unit. The display showed 38 degrees exactly, right where it should be. The smell couldn't be coming from her cargo, not at that temperature. Maybe something had died under her trailer, a small animal caught in the suspension. It happened sometimes. She kept driving. The smell continued to intensify. By the time she reached Chalice, 40 miles south of Salmon, the odor was making her gag. It wasn't just sweet anymore. It had taken on a rotten decay quality that made her stomach turn. Linda pulled over at a gas station in Chalice and walked around her truck trying to locate the source. Nothing. The trailer was sealed tight, the refrigeration unit humming steadily. She couldn't see any dead animals or obvious sources of the smell. But standing, this close to the trailer, the odor was overwhelming. It was definitely coming from inside. Linda pulled out the business card and called the number. It rang 6 times before someone picked up. A man's voice, flat and emotionless. "Status. This is Linda Martinez. I'm hauling the cargo from Salmon. There's a smell coming from the trailer, a bad smell. Temperature status? 38 degrees. The refrigeration is working fine, but whatever's in there. Continue to destination. Do not open the trailer." "I'm not opening it. I'm just telling you that something doesn't seem right. Whatever you've got in there, it smells like it's rotting." "That is expected. Continue to destination." Expected? What kind of scientific equipment smelled like rotting meat? Linda felt her professional instincts warring with her common sense. The money was excellent, but this was getting weird. "What exactly am I hauling?" she asked. "That information is classified. Continue to destination. Contact this number again only if the refrigeration fails." The line went dead. Linda stood in the gas station parking lot for a long moment, debating her options. She could refuse to continue, find somewhere to park the trailer and walk away from the job. but that would mean forfeiting the payment and possibly damaging her reputation with the broker. Or she could tough it out for another 3 or 4 hours, deliver the cargo and collect her money. In the end, professional pride won out. Linda climbed back into her cab, rolled down her windows despite the cold, and continued south on Highway 93. The smell got worse. By the time she turned east onto Highway 20 near Arco, Linda was breathing through her mouth and fighting waves of nausea. The odor had permeated her entire cab, seeping through the vents and seams of her truck. It coated her throat, made her eyes water, and underneath the rot-sweet smell there was something else. Something chemical and sharp that made her sinuses burn. Linda pulled over again, this time on the shoulder of Highway 20 where it cut through miles of empty high desert. She got out and stood in the cold night air, gulping in clean breaths, trying to clear the smell from her lungs. That's when she heard the noise. It came from inside the trailer. A soft, wet sound like something heavy shifting position. Then a scraping noise like nails or claws dragging across metal. Linda's blood ran cold. Scientific equipment didn't move, didn't make sounds. Whatever was in her trailer was alive. She approached the back doors slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. The padlock was still secure, the seal unbroken. But from inside the trailer, she could definitely hear something. Movement. And now that she was standing this close, she could hear something else too. Breathing. Slow and labored, but unmistakably breathing. Linda grabbed her phone and called the number again. It rang and rang and rang. No one answered. She stood there 15 feet from the trailer doors, listening to whatever was inside continue its slow movements. The rational part of her brain was screaming that this was wrong, that she needed to call the police, report whatever illegal thing she'd gotten mixed up in. But another part, the part that had driven trucks for 16 years and seen plenty of weird cargo, told her to just deliver the load and get the hell away from this job. She chose the latter. Linda climbed back into her cab and drove. Faster now, pushing her speed to 60, 65 on the straight sections of highway. She didn't care about fuel economy or safety regulations. She just wanted to get to Idaho Falls, drop this trailer, and forget this run had ever happened. Mile marker 50 appeared in her headlights, then 60, 70. Idaho Falls was getting closer, but every mile felt like an eternity. The smell in her cab was making her dizzy now, affecting her ability to think clearly. She kept her windows rolled down despite the freezing temperature, letting the wind blast through the cab. Around 1:30 in the morning, somewhere between Arco and Idaho Falls, the breathing changed. It became faster, more urgent. Linda could hear it clearly even over the noise of her engine and the wind rushing through her open windows. And then, cutting through all the other sounds, came something that made her blood freeze. Words. "Let me out." The voice was hoarse and wet, like someone speaking through a mouthful of liquid. It barely sounded human, more like an animal that had learned to mimic human speech. "Let me out. Please. It hurts." Linda's hands were shaking so badly she could barely keep the wheel straight. She wanted to respond, wanted to say something, but her throat had closed up with fear. All she could do was keep driving, keep pushing toward Idaho Falls and the end of this nightmare. Linda! It knew her name. Whatever was in that trailer, it knew her name. Linda Martinez, 16 years, independent trucker. "Please, let me out. I'm so hungry." Linda actually whimpered. How did it know those things about her? Had it somehow heard her phone conversation? Or was it something worse, something that could read her thoughts or access her memories? The trailer began to rock. Gently at first, then more violently, as if whatever was inside was throwing itself against the walls. Linda could see the movement in her mirrors. her whole trailer swaying side to side, threatening to jackknife her truck. "Let me out! Let me out! Let me out!" The voice had become a shriek now, inhuman and piercing. Linda pressed harder on the accelerator, 75 miles per hour, 80. Her truck was shaking, the trailer fishtailing behind her. Any second now she was going to lose control, flip her rig, die on this empty highway with whatever monster was in her trailer. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The rocking ceased, the shrieking cut off mid-word. Even the smell seemed to fade slightly. Linda's truck continued down Highway 20 at 80 miles per hour, but now it felt steady, normal. Linda risked a glance in her mirrors. The trailer looked fine, still attached, still upright, showing no signs of the violent movements from moments before. She didn't slow down. She maintained her speed all the way to Idaho Falls, finally reducing to normal highway speeds only when she started seeing the lights of the city ahead. The delivery location was an industrial complex on the eastern edge of town. Warehouses and loading docks identical to the pickup location in Salmon. Linda pulled into the complex at 2:45 in the morning. The same two men who'd loaded her trailer were waiting, even though she was hours ahead of schedule. They didn't ask questions or comment on her haggard appearance. They just directed her to a dock, removed the padlock she'd placed on the trailer, and went inside. Linda sat in her cab with the engine running, ready to drive away the moment they were done. She didn't want to see what they were unloading, didn't want to confirm her suspicions about what she'd been hauling across Idaho in the dead of night. But curiosity is a powerful force. When the two men emerged from the warehouse and waved her forward, indicating she was clear to disconnect her trailer and leave, Linda found herself climbing down from her cab and walking toward the loading dock. One of the men stepped in front of her. "Your payment will be transferred within 24 hours. You can go now." "What was I hauling?" Linda asked. "I have a right to know." The man's expression didn't change. "You don't have any rights except the ones specified in your contract, which included a confidentiality clause. I suggest you honor it." "Was it alive? Was there something living in my trailer?" For just a moment, less than a second, something flickered across the man's face. Fear? Disgust? Linda couldn't tell. "Go home, Ms. Martinez. Forget about this job. And if you value your career, never ask questions about it again." Linda wanted to push harder, wanted to demand answers, but the look in the man's eyes told her she'd get nothing. She turned and walked back to her cab, climbed in, and drove out of the complex. She stopped at an all-night truck wash on the outskirts of Idaho Falls and spent 2 hours scrubbing every surface of her cab, trying to eliminate the smell. It helped, but never completely disappeared. Even weeks later, on hot days, she'd catch a whiff of that rot-sweet odor and feel her stomach turn. Linda never found out what she'd hauled that night. The payment did arrive as promised. $5,000 transferred to her account with no identifying information. She called the broker to ask about it, but he claimed to have no record of the job. The business card with the phone number had mysteriously disappeared from her glove box. She told herself it had been some kind of biological research, tissue samples or specimens that needed controlled temperatures. The sounds and smells could be explained rationally if she tried hard enough. The voice? Maybe she'd been hallucinating from the smell. Her oxygen-deprived brain creating false memories. But late at night, when she was alone in her truck on some empty highway, Linda would remember. The sound of breathing in her trailer, the voice that knew her name, the feeling of being watched by something hungry and desperate. And she'd wonder if somewhere in Idaho, in some unmarked facility, there was something that still remembered her too. Something that was waiting for another trucker to make the mistake of hauling it across state lines. Something that was getting closer to freedom with every trip. Linda hoped she was wrong. But in her heart, She knew she wasn't. Anthony Russo had been driving the same route for 7 years, Boise to Coeur d'Alene via Highway 95, hauling auto parts to dealerships across northern Idaho. It was a long drive, nearly 500 miles, but Tony had it down to a science. He knew every rest stop, every good place to eat, every tricky stretch of road that required extra attention. He'd never once felt unsafe on this route, until February of 2024. Tony left Boise just after midnight on a Wednesday morning, his trailer loaded with transmissions, brake assemblies, and other automotive components. The weather forecast had called for clear conditions, and the first few hours of his drive confirmed it. Calm night, minimal traffic, good roads. Perfect for making time. He cruised through Horseshoe Bend and Banks without incident, then continued north through the wilderness area where Highway 55 became a winding mountain road. Around 2:30 in the morning, he reached New Meadows and merged onto Highway 95 north. From here, it was a straight shot to Coeur d'Alene, about 3.5 hours of driving through increasingly mountainous terrain. Tony settled into the rhythm of the road, his stereo playing a mix of 80s rock and modern country. The highway here was 2 lanes with minimal shoulder carved into mountainsides with sheer drop-offs on one side and rock walls on the other. During the day, the views were spectacular. At night, it was just darkness in the narrow corridor illuminated by his headlights. Around mile marker 370, Tony noticed headlights behind him. They appeared suddenly as if the vehicle had just turned onto the highway from a side road, though Tony couldn't remember passing any intersections recently. The headlights were bright, probably a truck or SUV, and they were coming up fast. Too fast. Tony checked his speedometer. He was doing 55 right at the speed limit for this section. The vehicle behind him had to be going 70 or 80 to be closing the distance so quickly. On these narrow, winding roads, that was dangerously fast. The vehicle drew closer, its headlights filling Tony's cab with harsh white light. Tony tapped his brakes, letting his taillights flash, a signal for the driver behind him to back off. The vehicle didn't slow down. Tony picked up his CB radio. "Northbound 95, you got a speeder coming up behind you. Looks like trouble." No response. The road up here was remote enough that there might not be any other truckers on this channel. But he'd tried. The vehicle was maybe 30 yards behind him now, its headlights so bright that Tony had to adjust his mirrors to avoid being blinded. He could make out the shape now. It was definitely a truck. Larger than a pickup but smaller than a semi, maybe a box truck or a commercial delivery vehicle. And it was still accelerating. Tony felt the first flutter of real concern. This wasn't just aggressive driving anymore. This was dangerous. If the truck didn't slow down, it was going to rear-end his trailer at highway speed. The impact would likely kill the other driver and possibly send Tony's rig off the road. He accelerated, pushing his speed up to 60-65. The truck behind him matched his speed, maintaining that same 30-yard gap. But now Tony could see something odd in his mirrors. The truck's headlights didn't move like normal headlights should. They didn't bounce or sway as the vehicle navigated the curves of the highway. They just stayed perfectly level, perfectly steady, as if the truck wasn't actually touching the road. Tony's concern was rapidly shifting to fear. He picked up his cell phone to call 911, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. This stretch of highway was notorious for dead zones, too remote and mountainous for good cell coverage. He was on his own. The truck behind him flashed its high beams, once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. Then it began honking its horn, long, aggressive blasts that echoed off the surrounding mountains. What the hell did this driver want? Tony wasn't blocking the road. There was no reason for this kind of harassment, unless the driver wasn't trying to get past him. Unless the driver was deliberately chasing him. That thought sent ice through Tony's veins. But why would anyone chase him? He wasn't hauling anything valuable, just auto parts. His truck was clearly marked with his company's logo. There was no reason for anyone to target him specifically. Mile marker 380 appeared in his headlights. The truck behind him crept closer, now maybe 20 yards back. Tony could hear its engine over the sound of his own, a deep, rumbling roar that sounded wrong somehow. Too loud, too aggressive, almost like an animal growling. The highway ahead began a long descent into a valley. Tony knew this section. It was called Whitebird Hill, named after the small town at the bottom. The grade was steep with multiple switchbacks that required careful speed control even in good conditions. Going down it at high speed in the dark while being pursued by an aggressive driver. That was suicide. But Tony didn't have a choice. The pursuing truck accelerated, closing the gap to less than 10 yards. Tony could see it clearly now in his mirrors, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The truck's grille looked wrong, twisted and misshapen as if it had been in multiple accidents and never properly repaired. And there was something dark splattered across it. Something that looked like blood in the harsh glow of his taillights. The truck rammed into the back of his trailer. The impact wasn't hard enough to cause serious damage, but it was enough to make Tony's rig shudder and sway. He gripped the wheel tighter, fighting to keep control as his trailer fishtailed slightly on the downhill grade. The truck rammed him again, harder this time. Tony's heart was racing now, adrenaline flooding his system. This wasn't road rage or aggressive driving. This was an attack. Something was deliberately trying to run him off the road. He pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing his truck to speeds that were wildly unsafe for this descent. 70 miles per hour. 75. His brakes were heating up from the constant application needed to control his speed on the steep grade. If they failed, he'd barrel straight through the guardrails and plummet hundreds of feet into the valley below. The pursuing truck matched his speed effortlessly, staying right on his bumper. Every few seconds, it would surge forward and strike the back of his trailer with a metallic crunch that Tony could feel through his entire rig. And all the while, that horn kept blaring, long, aggressive blasts that sounded less and less like a horn and more like some kind of howl. Tony came around a particularly sharp switchback, doing nearly 80 miles per hour, his trailer swinging wide and barely missing the guardrail. The pursuing truck took the turn impossibly tight, its tires, if it even had tires, not squealing or sliding the way they should have. It was defying physics, moving in ways that no normal vehicle could. That's when Tony realized the truth. Whatever was behind him wasn't a truck at all. It was something else, something that wore the shape of a truck the way a predator might wear camouflage. And it was hunting him. Mile marker 390 appeared briefly in his peripheral vision. Whitebird was getting closer, maybe 5 more miles. If he could just reach the town, get to a place with lights and people, maybe this thing would break off its pursuit. But 5 miles might as well have been 500. Tony's brakes were smoking now, the smell sharp and acrid in his nostrils. His trailer was swaying wildly with each turn, threatening to jackknife. And the thing behind him just kept coming, relentless and unstoppable. It rammed him again, harder than ever. Tony heard something in his trailer give way with a loud crack. His cargo was shifting, 20,000 pounds of auto parts sliding around inside the trailer, making his rig even more unstable. He couldn't keep this up much longer. Either his brakes would fail or his trailer would jackknife, or he'd simply lose control and crash. He was going to die on this mountain highway, chased by something that shouldn't exist. And then, like a miracle, Tony saw lights ahead. Not Whitebird. He was still miles from town. These were the lights of another vehicle coming up the hill toward him. A semi-truck, probably hauling freight up to Lewiston or beyond. The driver would see what was happening, would radio for help, would at least be a witness if this thing killed Tony. The northbound truck's headlights grew brighter as it approached. Tony could see it clearly now, a modern freightliner with a refrigerated trailer. The driver flashed his high beams in the standard trucker greeting as they approached each other. Tony looked in his mirrors. The pursuing truck was still there, maybe 5 yards behind him now, so close that he could see nothing. He could see nothing. Because where the cab should have been, where a driver should have been visible, there was just darkness. Empty space shaped like a truck, held together by nothing but malevolence and hunger. The two trucks passed each other, Tony heading downhill, the freightliner heading up. For just a moment, Tony had hoped that the presence of another driver would scare off his pursuer. But when he looked in his mirrors again, the thing was still there. And now it was changing. The truck shape was dissolving, falling apart like smoke in the wind. But something else was forming in its place, something larger. Something that didn't bother pretending to be a vehicle anymore. Tony's mind refused to fully process what he was seeing. His brain kept trying to fit it into familiar categories: animal, vehicle, machine. But it was none of those things. It was a shape in the darkness, a presence that his headlights couldn't quite illuminate. All he could make out were suggestions of form, things that might be legs or tentacles or something between the two. A mass that moved with fluid, predatory grace. And it was gaining on him. Mile marker 395. Whitebird was close now. Tony could see the glow of the town's lights reflecting off the low clouds. Just a little farther. Just a little. His brakes gave out. The pedal went to the floor with no resistance. Tony felt his stomach drop as his truck began to accelerate uncontrollably down the last stretch of Whitebird Hill. 85 miles per hour. 90. 95. The highway became a blur, the dotted center line strobing past faster than his eyes could track. The thing behind, him, surged forward, moving alongside his truck now. Tony could see it in his peripheral vision, something massive pacing him, keeping perfect speed as he rocketed down the mountain. It was toying with him. Had been toying with him this whole time. It could have caught him whenever it wanted. Whitebird came up fast, too fast. Tony was going to shoot straight through the little town at close to 100 miles per hour. There was no way to stop, no way to turn. He was going to crash and die, and that thing was going to be there when it happened, waiting to... The truck stop appeared on his right, a brightly lit Texaco station with pumps and a small convenience store. Without thinking, operating purely on instinct, Tony yanked his wheel to the right. His truck left the highway, tires shrieking as they hit the truck stop's parking lot. He aimed for the softest thing he could see, a snowbank that had been plowed up against the back of the property. His rig hit the snowbank doing 70 miles per hour. The impact was tremendous, throwing Tony forward against his seatbelt so hard that he heard ribs crack. His windshield spiderwebbed but didn't break. The cab crumpled slightly and then everything was still. Tony sat there, gasping for breath, his vision swimming with black spots. Alive. He was somehow still alive. He fumbled with his seatbelt, finally getting it unbuckled, and kicked open his door. He half fell, half climbed out of the cab and stumbled toward the lights of the convenience store. Behind him, at the edge of the parking lot where the light from the truck stop faded into darkness, something watched. Tony could feel its gaze on his back, could sense its rage at losing its prey. But it didn't follow him into the light. Whatever rules governed that thing, whatever limitations it operated under, it couldn't or wouldn't come into the illuminated areas. Tony burst through the convenience store doors, startling a young clerk who'd been reading a magazine behind the counter. "Call 911, Tony gasped. "I was chased. Something on the highway. It tried to run me off the road." The clerk stared at him. "Are you okay? You look hurt." Tony realized he was probably in shock, his adrenaline starting to wear off and reveal the injuries he'd sustained in the crash. His chest hurt where the seatbelt had caught him and his head was pounding. "Just call 911, he repeated, "please." The clerk made the call. Within 20 minutes, the truck stop was full of emergency vehicles, police cars, an ambulance, even a fire truck. EMTs checked Tony over, confirmed he had 2 cracked ribs and a mild concussion, but nothing life-threatening. Police officers took his statement, nodding politely as he described being chased down Whitebird Hill by an aggressive driver. He didn't tell them about the truck dissolving into something else, didn't mention the shape in the darkness that had paced him as his brakes failed. He knew how that would sound. But one officer, an older man with gray hair and tired eyes, pulled Tony aside as they were finishing up. "You're lucky," he said quietly. "Whitebird Hill has a bad reputation, lots of accidents over the years, and sometimes drivers report being chased, usually late at night, usually when they're alone." Tony met the officer's eyes. "What is it?" The officer shook his head. "I don't know. Mountain roads do funny things to people's minds, especially at night. Lack of sleep, stress, shadows playing tricks. That's what the official reports say anyway. And unofficially?" The officer was quiet for a long moment. "Unofficially? Stay off Highway 95 at night if you can avoid it. And if you can't, if you absolutely have to drive through, don't stop. Don't slow down. And whatever you do, don't look too closely at anything that might be following you." Tony's truck was totaled, the front end too damaged to repair, the cargo in the trailer destroyed. His company's insurance covered most of the losses, and Tony was back on the road 3 months later after his ribs healed. But he never took the Highway 95 route again. He added hours to his deliveries by taking alternate routes, even when his dispatcher complained about the inefficiency. The money wasn't worth it. Nothing was worth risking another encounter with whatever lived in those mountains. Because Tony knew the truth now. Idaho's highways weren't always safe. Sometimes they were hunting grounds, and sometimes late at night when the roads were empty and the darkness pressed close, the predators came out to feed. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, like the video, subscribe, and stay tuned for more terrifying tales coming soon.